Hi, welcome to Construction One-on-One, Episode 4 with Ravi Bhatia. Got a special guest today, Mr. John Immitt, an accomplished construction professional and architect with over 40 years of experience. I've had the pleasure of knowing John for many years, worked with him. He's been a friend and a mentor and a leader in our industry. John, how are you?
Great, Ravi. Thanks for having me here.
My pleasure. John, you and I go back a long ways, and your career in construction has spanned some of the greatest changes we've seen in our industry. You've been involved with construction management, real estate development. You've been in leadership positions at GCs, CMs, and private developers. You've also worked as a consultant on your own. Can you walk us through your journey and what has been interesting about it, what's been special about it, and what you've learned over decades? How did you get into construction?
That's a great question, but let me start by saying when I went to City College here, I'm a New York boy, um, grown, educated, and worked my entire career in the greater metropolitan area. And I loved the city, and it was a great nurturing experience of life to actually be involved in this industry. But it started out, strangely enough, when I went to City College. My father was pushing me to be an attorney. After 2 years of political science, but fabulously in love with mathematics, I went to good old dad and I said, "Dad, I'm never going to cut it as an attorney." He says, "Why?" I says, "My heart's not in it. I want to be an engineer." So I switched to the School of Engineering. And that's where my career started. But I picked, not that I picked, but the worst possible time to do it was the late 60s, early 70s. Ravi, it was the depths of the stagflation era where there was just nothing going on. But I was fortunate to get a job while I was still in school as a draftsperson in a small architectural firm. And I went on to a more medium-sized architectural firm, and then on to a very large architectural firm. And I'm not going to name names. Just it's not. Most people wouldn't even remember to know the names of what I speak because they're all gone. But during my days with the last architectural and engineering firm, is where I met my mentor from the firm that you and I met at. Is it okay to say names here? Is that
Yeah, I
fair?
think that's fine. I mean, this is, we're all friends, right?
I don't want to focus on that, but it was that
Yeah,
structure tone.
right.
And I was headhunted by one of the principals there on a project that we were doing together. And he made a proposition to me that took me totally aback because it was a rethink time. I'm going to try to categorize that rethink time for everybody who's ever been interested in real estate design and construction in that total envelope of that industry by saying that remember one thing that this industry will never change, and then we'll get into the changes. It's a brick on a brick. All life in this industry is about a brick on a brick. It's about building and the competency of building. And what he proposed at the time was something I never gave a thought about because I was an architect and engineer. That's how I graduated from City College with both degrees. And back then, you needed to have that. City College was unique at the time because you couldn't sit for your architectural thesis to get a B.Arch degree unless you were from science or engineering. So that's what I got. I got a bachelor's of science in engineering. And I think that I learned more there than I did for the B.Arch because it was about how do you go about putting a brick on a brick? And that is the competency level that regardless of all the absolutely meteoric changes over my lifetime that I saw in this industry, that's the one thing that never changed, the competency of how to build. So for all those that might see this podcast and are thinking about or being currently educated in or already are in it at some early stage, the main thing to focus on is your technical competency in order to really benefit from this industry. So I'm going to start with the changes of my time in the early 70s to now. Because you asked, what did I see over the course of my career? Which, unfortunately, Ravi, you were a decade off. It's over 50 years now. So I'm showing my age bad time, aren't I?
No, but that's great though, because that's what we want to know from the wisdom that you've acquired. But I really appreciate you talking about the technical competence, because we live in a world of instant gratification, and one of the things we talk to young engineers, young architects, young construction professionals about is that you have to have some patience, diligence, and you have to put in decades of work in order to arrive at a point where you can even think about having a level of confidence that the market demands.
Oh, absolutely. In my early days with architectural firms, I was first exposed to the fact, because quite honestly, as great a time as I had at City College, it was very insulated. We didn't have much exposure to the rest of the educational world in the industry of engineering, architecture, construction, etc. But when I started working for firms, I ran across people that went to Harvard School of Design. And what I was amazed at, and this, I'm not knocking, places like the Harvard School of Design or all those others, but the ones that had a real interest in what I'm going to call core competency, as opposed to design with a capital D, came from schools like Pratt and Brooklyn Polytech and City College, because what City College was trying to produce were people who would give back to the city by having the core competency for what the city was always known for. New York City is something that never stops changing. We have a lot of old stock in buildings, which are fabulous. It's like a history book of how to build in virtual, not virtual time, in real time. And the modern, all the way to the modern technologies that have evolved over what I've seen over my time. But what I noticed was that there were people coming out of the big D design mentality that couldn't put a set of working drawings together. And in those days, we didn't have computers.
Right.
You went home to and arduously washed your hands of all the graphite on your hands from drawing 8 hours a day, and then having to go out into the field. And I'm going to come back to the field in a minute. So what you learn by being on the boards is something that you had to find that information. It wasn't at your fingertips like it is today.
You couldn't Google it in those days. You had to actually research.
Go on to the internet. I remember that the biggest thing that happened was finding shelf space for all the suites catalogs and manuals and stuff that you had to rifle through to find something as simple as what's the appropriate, lock designation for this door.
But yet you did
What's
that.
the right rebar? Yeah.
You knew which book to pull out and what page to go to find the right part that you needed.
Right. And then all of a sudden, my first introduction before I joined Structure Tone with computerization was that suites, you could buy it on a CD. And they would sell the CD with updates. Not CD, excuse me, floppy disk, right? Then as the world evolved today, thankfully, Because let me tell you, there was nothing more boring than having to do your R&D for simple stuff like where do I get these kind of rebars? Today, it's at your fingertips, and you save so much valuable time getting that information. But what also I've noticed is the dependency on it becomes sometimes, I don't know, I may be politically incorrect to say this, sometimes becomes robotic. I found it on the internet, it's fine. Okay. But the internet, the information you find is only as good as the people that put it on there.
Right.
So you still have to have that core competency to understand that what you found is appropriate, let alone even correct. And you know that from your own experience because you've been in more of the technological end of the industry than myself.
It's so interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes, Ravi?
No, I was
No,
just saying
no,
it's
go
so
ahead.
interesting to hear you talk about that, because I had this conversation recently, and I've been very fortunate. Three of my bosses and mentors in my career have been City College graduates, and one of the things we can all acknowledge is that when you went to City College, I mean, it was an elite program, meaning that people who went there became leaders, but they learned hands-on. I know from my own experience that with all the computerization, and today, if you go to an engineer and say, you know, give me an isometric of this, you know, just draw an isometric, do this, and people don't have that skill set. You know, they can go on a computer and put dots and lines, but to actually do a freehand sketch of something, a part or a model of something, that skill has been eroded for the most part. I'm not generalizing too much, I hope, but I've seen that.
No, I don't. No, I don't think you're generalizing too much. I think, and this is again, it's not the people, the young people that are coming through the industry that are at fault. It's the educational programs. They are not focusing enough on that, and those that have benefited from getting that kind of core competency and knowledge will rapidly rise to the top because regardless of their big D capabilities, you know, you'll always see, you know, I had the benefit of working with a famous architect on a very big project in my architectural career. His name was Paul Rudolph. I say that name today, many people won't even recognize who he is. He was one of the leaders in modern architecture in the days when I was growing up in the industry. And the project was in Singapore. Paul Rudolph, his background was not a college degree, although he later got one. He was a Navy CB. The CB was the construction battalion.
Wow.
During the war, he was in the Navy and he had to build airfields. He had to build facilities for the soldiers in the island hopping thing that happened during the Pacific arena of World War II. And he learned how to build hands-on. It wasn't something in school. It wasn't a mentor that gave him this, that, or the other thing. He had to do it for sheer survival. And when he went into private practice as an architect, it showed that he had the ability to think about not only his big D design, but the little d, which is the most important part in my book, of the core competency on how to get that built. And what he was flexible and adaptive because the project in Singapore, he was famous for his concrete work. Okay, he loved to work in concrete. He called it the fluid plastic because every form you could make, right? But in Singapore, you can't have exposed concrete because the environment would produce fungus and mildews and molds that would eat the concrete alive. He had to become an expert on how to clad the building in ceramics. And he mastered it because he knew that the core competency of the buildings he was designing for these people in Singapore was, hey, the way I did it will not work here. because I am in a different part of the world. And that part of the world says, Paul, forget about the beauty of exposed concrete, because in a few years, it's not going to be anything near beauty. So that's what I mean by that's another part of it, is flexibility in the approach of construction, right? The thing that I saw over time in terms of that element of it was a decline. People today approach things with a fixed mentality. This is the way we are going to do something.
That's kind of
And
sad.
you can't do that. The first thing you got to remember, no matter what part of this industry you are in, whether it's an engineer or an architect or a construction manager or a carpenter or a mason, is you have a client that has a need. He will express to you that need. But he's not doing it as an engineer or an architect, because if he was, he wouldn't need you. He's not expressing it to you as a construction expert, because if he were, he wouldn't need you. He's expressing it in a business term. So that's another thing that I think the industry has to learn how to deal with. All construction has a business purpose. Doesn't matter what that purpose is.
And that's where our careers intersected, because I worked for you. You brought me on at Structure Tone, and really I learned from you what it meant to be a successful construction manager, and of course Structure Tone, one of the iconic great companies in our industry. And I learned a lot about working with clients from you, and I have so many lessons, but one of the ones that really stands out, one time I think you were on vacation, I think you were gone for a week, and when you came back, you said, "Hey Ravi, how come you didn't send this requisition out?" And I said, I was just waiting, maybe I was waiting for another approval. I don't know why I didn't send it out. And then you told me that you will tolerate, and that the industry and that our bosses would tolerate errors of commission, but not errors of omission. You've got to take action, and that stuck with me forever. I mean, when I think of you, that's a lesson that can never be lost. But there were other lessons like that, because one of the things we learned working together was that it was always about treating the client well, and in many cases anticipating what the client wanted, because the client's business was not construction. That's why they hired us, as you said.
Exactly right. You know what? If you remember that project, I remember it. That was 60 Wall Street. I remember it well. It was a great project for everybody involved. You may remember why I brought you on.
It was a long time ago.
The interview, okay? I told our bosses at the time, I said, look, and they had the forethought of putting computers on everybody's desk. And I remember that story, which is a different story, when I walked into office one day and I saw what I thought was a TV on my desk. And I said, this is not
Nobody
like
had computers.
Okay. They don't expect me to watch TV. If they found me watching TV, they'd kick my ass out of the office and say, get to work.
Wow.
But it was an IBM desktop computer. Okay. But all sorts of programs that no longer even exist. And I learned how to use it. Richard Hart took to it like a duck takes to water.
He was made for that. He was made for that. Yeah.
I think the industry was made for Richard. And he was a whiz kid at it, but only to a certain limit. But when we got that project, which at the time was enormous, way beyond anything we had ever done before, I looked at the logistical requirements for just doing the paperwork. And I went home that day and I scratched my head and I said, there is not one of the many incredibly talented people at Structure Tone that has a clue as to the task, the logistical task of what we have to produce record-wise to feed the information into everybody working on that site. There's just no way we have it. And I searched high and low, for somebody that could do it. And I knew Richard wouldn't have the time to do it. I mean, he was, at that point, he was still learning on it. I was behind him in learning on it. And I remember interviewing you. And I told you what the problems were. And you said, oh, yeah, okay. I said, what do you mean, okay? I said, yeah, we could do that. And I said, show me. And you did. And I said, wait here. And I went over to our bosses. I'm not going to name names. I went over to our bosses and said, my hunt is over. They said, what do you mean? You've been cursing us because for 2 weeks we haven't sent you one resume that you didn't throw out the door. I said, we have him. He's here.
Wow. Well, thank you.
Oh, no, thank you.
Yes,
Because
that changed everything. I mean,
if you remember that just to get, and this enabled an idea that I really am proud of. I call it warehousing. Because at the time, nobody wanted to buy more than we could chew, meaning the vast amount of product.
Right.
But there was so much repetition of the product. I said, here's the deal we got to make. Forget the sub. We got to go to the manufacturer of that raised floor. Remember the raised floor?
Yes.
That manufacturer of the ceiling tile. That manufacturer of this, that, and the other thing. And we just got to either get them to buy into warehousing it for us and having it at our fingertips, or do it ourselves. And the only way we managed it, if you recall, was through the computerization of our purchasing.
I felt like as a construction management firm, we were really ahead of the curve on all of that. I remember also on some of the projects, including Marsh, we used DBase 3 to track our change orders because at that time, Lotus 1, 2, 3 did not have the capabilities of database management. And we used direct, and I think under your guidance, we I think started our first cost control department, which ended up to be a huge aspect of how we manage projects. But I remember tracking the change orders on DBase 3 and really gave an organization and a structure to it that could be appreciated by our clients because it gave them all the data that they needed, as opposed to, it wasn't just a lump sum. It was like, here's the breakout. And I thought that was really, that was revolutionary at the time. We didn't realize it. We were just doing what we needed to do, but it was a very interesting time working in the CM environment in those days, in the late 80s and early 90s, working with customers and showing them that we could add a lot of value using technology, not as in ends, but just, it was just a tool, right?
Well, there was another thing that I think, we're talking about the evolution of it. In the days that I was working in the architectural and engineering side of the business or the industry, there was a great deal of what I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, isolation of each individual piece of the industry itself. There was the real estate part, there was the design part, the engineering part, the construction part, and there was no interfacing. Right, the architect would do the basic stuff, then he would bring in the engineers. I always felt that was a really dumb way to do it.
So it wasn't like a coordinated effort, right? It was more like everybody
the coordination, right? You know when the coordination happened? The architect would finish all his schematics, as he called them, or even into design development drawings, go to a light table with the engineer so that the engineer could see everything, and he would then come back with a sketch to overlay on that same light table. And I'm thinking, this is ass backwards, right? This is like architecture in search of mechanical, or it's mechanical in search of architecture. Why isn't it that we don't work together to make sure that the conflicts that inevitably will arise, okay, are foreseen at the design stage rather than a change order? Okay, that's where, and by the way, that still exists today, sadly.
Yeah, pre-construction. That's what one of the main courses that we have at Fordham. We talk about pre-construction and planning and development. And we've had this conversation about design build, right? Today, Government agencies are practicing design build nationally, but it's not a new thing. You were doing design build many years ago, right? What's your view on that?
We were. The philosophy was that was developed back in the days that you and I first met. That philosophy was engage the design side, the architects, engineers, and other specialists, because as technology grew, you wound up with other specialists too. Sound specialists, security specialists, this guy, that guy, all those disciplines had to be incorporated. Well, when you come down to it, even though you used the word before, brick on a brick, I meant that euphemistically. Speakers in the sound system are, to me, are brick on a brick. It's putting the pieces together in a way to avoid the problems that have always plagued this industry, which is that ugly, disgusting, needless word called the change order. The most ridiculous thing I ever heard out of architects' mouths is, and that's because we didn't have that attitude, is that you're just looking for a change order. I said, you didn't start constructing yet, so how could I look for a change order? The reason why you're here with us now, because and a lot of them would resist getting involved with the pre-construction process, if you recall. I don't know if you recall sometimes that Gensler, who was a great architectural firm that we were working with on 60 Wall, if it wasn't for some of the people that foresaw and welcomed the process, we never would have gotten out of our own way. And that was the first architectural firm I dealt with in the construction side that welcomed and engaged with us for that project. And if you recall, the change, as big as that project was, we stayed on budget. In fact, we beat the budget, all right, by millions of dollars, not just a little bit, because we had the architects and engineers convinced that the pre-construction part would make their job easier and would make the whole team look so much better, such to the point that they just handed us 23 Wall Street right thereafter, and other various projects.
You just said in the last 3 minutes, I'm going to frame that for my students, because in the pre-construction class, I want them to hear that it's working in collaboration. Today, a lot of infrastructure projects are also going the CMAR route, but it's not new, right? Architects, engineers, whether you're on the construction side or you're on the owner side, working together during pre-construction to add value to the project. That doesn't mean there won't be change orders later, but you want to capture really the business case and the business need and make sure that what you're designing and what you're building meets the budget. And that's
exactly
really
right.
a challenge.
Look, I also worked on pure bid jobs. And one of the things that I was always deathly afraid of in the meetings, the project meetings with the client, is when they turned to the architect and said, "What is that?" And the architect would say, "What do you mean?" He says, what do we have that for?" And the table would go dead silence, because they knew that there was a gap between the business model and the design. And that gap was a total lack of understanding of what something in the project was even there for, or missing from. And I would sometimes just have, oh my God, we're now we're going to have a problem, because it would involve a change order.
Right.
And then the client would see that because of something and that was either in there that shouldn't have been, or missing that should have been there, it's coming out of his pocket in some way, shape, or form, time and or money. They're basically the same thing in my book. But
look, owners, developers, they don't like change orders. One of the things that we used to do at Madison Equities, which I really enjoyed, the pre-construction side of it, because when we had a concept for a project, the first thing we would do is we would bring our curtain wall consultant, because he had the idea of what the building might look like in terms of environmentally and wind and resisting the elements. And we would have the structural engineer and the architect and the mechanical engineer in the room during the concept stage, so that we could figure out what the floor plates are going to look like generally, and figure out what the massing diagram was, so that and those conflicts that we generated. I mean, some of those sessions got heated, where the structural engineer would be, yelling and screaming because we wanted to make the slab thickness, 8 inches so we can get more ceiling height. And the mechanical engineer would say, well, you're not giving me shaft space for all of my pipes and ductwork. But that's where the big decisions were made. But there was nothing technical about it, meaning we were working off pretty much back of a napkin, just trying to figure out, can we find economic value in this project to justify the investment by the general partner and by the equity investors.
So, the something that you just mentioned too is that we mentioned previously, the computerization in the industry, which was a godsend in many respects. But I think one of the biggest godsends was the ability for computers to actually project in 3D the plans and designs that were made. Because it's very, the human mind is such that there are people who can envision in 3D, and there are people that absolutely cannot. Doesn't make them better or worse for it. It's just whether or not they have that aptitude to do that. But with the computerization, it becomes possible. And I was on a project you weren't involved with, where and it was for a bunch of attorneys. It was a huge attorney office that was being ripped to the bones and redone. They couldn't see the plans. So I asked the architect, do you have, and I didn't know how to use this program. I said, but do you have the ability to take your CAD and coordinate it with, and I forget the name of the 3D program, because not all of them were compatible with CAD.
Yeah,
Right.
AutoCAD was one of the early ones, I guess. Maybe it was
Yeah. But he had it. And he said, I know exactly what you're talking about, John. I'm going to put that together. And it was so great because with the mouse at hand and the computer image, the 3D computer image on this huge screen that he connected the laptop to, he was able to walk through the space and show the attorneys what they would have when it was built. And it was comical in the first session because everybody would be raising their hand saying, I don't like that. Oh, that's great. Can I have one of those? And so forth. But we hadn't started construction. So he did get sent back to the drawing board, quote unquote, okay, with a whole bunch of input. And he did another presentation. By that time, 90% of all those issues were addressed.
Think about it. You're solving the customer's problems before you get to the field, right? So
before it gets to the final drawings that you're even going to build by. Now, this ability to do that and working on a CM basis with that architect, the client, who was a repeat client, we built their original building space, and now we are building the new one. And it was with a different firm, Ravi. And what I remember that really thrilled me to death was that I had maybe a dozen change orders during the entire course of the project.
Wow.
You know what the worst one was? And it was a goof that I said, we as a construction firm got to eat this. They wanted this huge, and they no longer even care about this anymore. It was a huge screen. Think of it as the biggest flat screen in the world. It was custom made in their conference room.
Folding into the ceiling?
We had to take the windows out to get it in by a crane.
Was it a roll down screen?
I wasn't aware, neither was anybody else, that they had changed. There was going to be separate screens with a multi-screen view like traders have, okay? But one screen. one monolithic one, which in today would be silly to do. Okay, they paid far more than if they did the multi-screen. But how do you get it in the building? So it's no guarantee that these conflicts will not arise. But as you and I know, prior planning prevents you know what. So that over the course of my career, what I've seen is both the development of the technology to the point where these kind of things you and I take for granted today is it's commonplace, can happen. But there's something that isn't happening. And it was prevalent thousands of years ago. There was no distinguishing the architect from the people that build whatever.
You mean the master builder, right?
When the
That concept of master builder.
Right. Because the word architect derives from the Latin master builder, like you just said. So all he was like the quarterback of a team. Okay, they designed and they knew the general idea, but the whole team of masons and whatever were brought together and built it together. Yes, it took them a long time. They didn't have cranes and they didn't have technology, so it took a couple of generations, sometimes or more, to finish. These beautiful edifices that we take for granted on tour guides, all right? But it was a one thing. Today we call it design build.
Right.
You brought up design build.
Yeah, master builder.
And I remember you.
Great projects.
You told me about it. No, what I was going to say is you told me about a case on a project where you guys, the firm you're with, they wanted design build, but the bureaucratic infrastructure that you had to deal with on the governmental end, because it was a public infrastructure, couldn't let it go. They were still dealing with the hammer and chisel compared to, in terms of the administrative approach, as opposed to the design build, which is light, nimble, flexible, because here's what I, as the business person, in this case, the city, need from you. Here's the ball. Go do it. And you would have one entity doing everything. And the only prescription for it was, here's the budget, here's the product we're looking for, go do it. Now, when it works well, which private industry has seen the benefit thereof, but so little advancement, Ravi, and this is the disappointment I see. So little advancement has occurred. My perspective is, as an architect and engineer, going to be a GC, becoming construction management, becoming a consultant for development, is that what's missing is that it is still, majority of times, that mentality.
But that's got to be changing. I sense it's got to change, right? It's got to be getting better.
I sense too. Oh, Ravi, you and I have both talked about this, numerous times. We're hoping it changes. And what it really needs, though, is a change in the attitude in order to make it work. One of the criticisms I keep on hearing, which is kind of annoying in a way, is the accusation that design build will incubate corruption. Well, I see it as the opposite. With design build, there's none of this going on, where then this becomes the solution of collusion becomes the solution to the problem rather than cooperation. And the bottom line product suffers because you are, by not approaching it the intelligent way, meaning the way it was intended to be done, with one-stop shop. You, regardless of who that is, private or public, say, this is what I need. And you go out and solicit proposals based on design build. You've got to understand what you no longer do. You no longer put a cover over that restricts the benefit of it. And by that I mean the bureaucracy of this checks and balance thing that you're thinking about. The checks and balance happens within the design build. That's what design build does, is it incorporates its checks and balances within itself.
So that level of technical conflict is a good thing, because we are fighting for resources, but we're not fighting. What we're doing is we're engaging in a healthy conflict to come up with more value for the project.
Right. Exactly.
And
exactly
that's
right.
that level of collaboration. So my sense is that as there's more information available, you know, everybody has information, or I would say more data at their fingertips. It doesn't mean they can do something useful with it, but as long as they're somewhat knowledgeable, they can find solutions. But it still comes down to owners, contractors, designers working together in collaboration. And that's the part that's lagged technology. I think we'll all agree with that. Or even in a design build world, you know, sometimes owners will still want to stay overly involved with the design. So part of it is not only letting go, but having that level of trust. And that, I think that trust has to come, because we have a nation where we are rebuilding our infrastructure, and there's a lot of work to be done collectively, working together and not pointing fingers.
Oh, I did. Look, you know, if things devolve into a blame game on a project, you're doomed.
Right.
You're absolutely doomed. You know, I'm going to give you a human example of this. I was taught in the early days of my career that when you walk onto a construction site, and by the way, I'm going to take a little side road here. Walk on a construction site, boots on the ground. This industry is, for all its technology, what I want to emphasize is don't go virtual. The real world is where you see it, because there's nothing like seeing what's happening being on the site. I don't care if the site is 100 acres or the site is a one floor in an office building. If you're not going to put boots on the ground, if you're not going to put your eyeball on it, remember that phrase, I got to get my eye on it?
Okay. Got to get your eye on it.
All right. You're not seeing the real world. Greatest technology is, don't let it become a drug that puts you to sleep, that everything in the world is fine.
And sometimes as construction professionals, there's a risk of losing that ability to touch and feel a project. One of the great people I work for, the owner of Madison Equities, he taught me a lot, and he said that you cannot be a great builder in New York City, you cannot be a great developer until you walk on the rebar. And he actually told that to a potential equity partner, because they wanted to know, you know, how did you build all these great development projects? And he said, because we walk on the rebar.
Absolutely. Great way of putting it. You know, back to what I was, when they said, one of the things I was taught is, when you walk on a construction site, before you see anything, notice whether it's clean, organized, safe. Now, let's think about that for a minute. Clean, what does that mean? Construction sites are notoriously filthy, which is the sign that people don't care. They don't care about keeping their house in order, and therefore it becomes unsafe, and therefore it also reflects itself in the quality of the outcome. So when you get boots on the ground, you walk on the job site, and you see that the management of that site is, we're going to keep it clean because we want to be safe.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very important.
Very important. Safety, to me, without cleanliness, there is no safety. Without safety and cleanliness, there is no quality. Because you can't
safety and quality go together. So I have this conversation with a friend of mine who's head of safety and quality for an international firm, and we agreed that it's unlikely that you would have a project that has high level of safety but low quality. They go together. So if your quality isn't good, chances are your safety is going to be suspect as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if there's one thing that will delay a project more than anything else, it's accidents, which are totally avoidable. You know, people call them an accident. I call them products of negligence because uh, it's no coincidence to me that a well-ordered site is safe and will produce good quality.
I'm so glad you
So,
brought up this topic because this is a really important topic in our industry as the expectation of safety and quality that bar is continuing to rise because we have tools, we have technology, we are aware, and it's not only the cost financially, but the human cost. Everybody who goes on a site is entitled to go home safely to their families, and that conversation, that communication, I think is front and center today in the industry. And I'm really glad that you brought that up.
well, it's always key to me. And every time, you know, some owners would say to me, well, how'd you see that going to happen? I said, because what I saw wasn't happening. When that's absent from a job, and this is why I have to stress, I saw ads in some journal recently, maybe it was Engineering News Record, I don't recall. It said, no need for site visits, totally virtual for a project manager.
That
And
is
I thought to
ridiculous.
myself, that doesn't exist. I mean, come on, man. I mean, can you see, you know, some of the builders of 1,000 years ago,
Oh man,
sitting in a palace saying,
it sounds
well,
like a
we
joke though,
will get
right? It sounds like a joke. You have to be on site. I mean, unless you're managing a software project that you can do virtually, but you really have to be on site. You said something earlier that was really interesting. You talked about flexibility, and I'm going to tie that into innovation because everyone talks about innovation, but part of being innovative as a team, as an organization, is to have the flexibility of thinking to accept or at least um, engage in new ideas and not just be married to our own ideas.
Oh, Ravi, that's so important in everything. I mean, we benefit in our society to the degree that it still exists, where competition breeds economically breeds so much creativity. People come up with things,
That's
and
right.
we may not be aware of them until they hit us in the face, but we got to be aware to the point where what hits you in the face is a good thing. Let's take it as an opportunity. Don't
Our
take it as
system is so great though, because our system generates innovation. And I had this conversation with a group of graduate students who had come from overseas to study in New York. And I asked them a very simple question over dinner. I said, you know, you could learn technically everything that we're studying about project management. You're getting a master's degree. You could learn that from a book anywhere. But why are you here in person? And I said, one of the great lessons you want to take away, whether you stay here or go back to your home country, is that we have something unique in America. There's something in our culture, in our system that fosters innovation. And that's something we should be very proud of as a nation because countries cannot copy the innovative spirit. You cannot copy the DNA of a country that's built on a pioneering mindset, on a mindset of rewarding risk. We reward entrepreneurial risk, and that's not something that most countries can say. And look at all the great technological advancements that everyone in the world uses. You know, I'll give you a simple example: GPS. GPS is available freely to the world. Was developed here. And look at all the great products that we make. So, you know, if you look back at the great projects internationally, the dams, the bridges, they want American know-how, not just the technical know-how, but I think that innovation mindset. And so how do we convey that to the next generation of architects and engineers?
well, I mentioned before that one of the things that I'm not encouraged that much by is the educational level of core competency. You know, so then you got to get down to what do you define as competency? Well, I define it not just as what you know, but what you're willing to go and find out more about and to employ in what you're doing. without fear of failure. You cannot be a competent person, and it may sound counterintuitive. You cannot be a competent person if you're afraid to fail, because you're not guaranteed success. What you're guaranteed as an individual in this industry is if you are knowledgeable about what you're doing, if you give care to what you're doing, and if you're open-minded about those things that are going to come by, like the things you just mentioned, something as simple as GPS, okay? One of the things that came out of it recently that I went to a lecture on was surveying. The ability for surveying today, for the basic land information to give to engineers and architects is lightning fast. In the old days, you would see these guys with tripods going out and doing all these measurements and everything, all gone. With a few electronic tools, the surveying can be done lightning fast and can give those people the necessary information they need to start a project that used to take so much time. You know, in our day, when I was coming out of school, you were taught the phases of a project, okay? And it start with the conceptual phase, to the schematic phase, to the design development phase, to the bidding and negotiation phase, to the construction phase, and to the post-construction phase. And I said, 6 phases? Why don't you just do the phase all in one? What is the point of doing these demarks that take months at a time when today we have the technology to compress it all into, hey, everybody get around the table. This is the project. We got the survey now. We know the land thing to do. I mean, take your work with infrastructure. So much information is lacking when you go into the infrastructure projects you're doing, like whether it's the electrical infrastructure for the transportation area of the world, right? Nobody had the records. So what do you have to do? You have to survey it. Well, that ability that I was shown, which I am totally incapable of doing myself, but understand that the tools are there. Now, people said, well, what if you got something wrong in that? What if you did? Why are you afraid of what you might not be able to do as seeing what you can do?
Such important points. Your point on failure and fear of failure. So I think this applies to everything, right? Like project management. If you want to be a great project leader, if you're afraid to fail, you'll never try anything new. And one of the things that we're conditioned by, maybe it's our environment or the education system itself, which really hasn't kept pace. The idea that somebody's going to pass or fail, or we breed a generation of people that are looking for an attaboy and not taught that, hey, sometimes you better try something new. And there was a famous management expert in the 80s, Tom Peters, who talked a lot about project leadership, right? Remember Tom Peters, In Search of Excellence and all that. And
Yep.
he said, I would reward excellent failure, but I would punish mediocre success. And it took me a while to understand that, but I said, yeah, if somebody does something very, if you never get out of bed in the morning, you're not going to fail, right? So at some point, you have to take some risk. The other thing that I tell students about is that if you want to be a great project leader, you got to stop caring about taking credit for everything. In fact, if you're really good as a project manager, you should be invisible to the extent that you get no credit. And that's a tough one sometimes for students to accept, because imagine if you do your job so well as a project leader that if you go away for a few weeks and the project keeps running itself, you've done a very good job, but you're not going to get the credit, nor should you seek it. And I think that's a level of maturity that comes with experience, but sometimes people don't get it, but it's important.
Oh, you mentioned the word leadership, that I forget who said it. It may have been Lao Tzu, many millennia ago, who said that a true leader is one who makes people believe that everything that they should have done, he had nothing to do with.
We did it ourselves.
Okay.
That was Lao Tzu, yeah. From that was Lao Tzu,
right?
from Taoism.
Right. And, you know, when you think about that, my success of my career and you in your career is that you're too busy to even look for the credit, for the pat on the back. Okay. Because if the project was a success, where it really leads you to is that you had a great learning experience, because now you know those things that work, that make something successful. And one of the biggest things I've always learned is if you get that thing we called about before, just we'll call it in our jargon, the pre-construction part, to get everybody together to work well so that during the course of the job, it's almost seamless. It goes by itself. Okay, it's moving forward inexorably because all the things that were necessary to build the engine to get it to move forward are done. You're not waiting for it to happen. You're not waking up one morning to say, okay, so what are we going to do today? You don't have to. You already know what you're doing today because
it was a great president.
It keeps going.
I don't know if it was Truman who said this, but it was a president who said that if you don't care about who gets credit, you can accomplish just about anything.
Right.
That's really something.
I remember hearing that too, but I can't recall who said it, which means
it might have been
that
Truman.
that person was really, truly great.
you know, so we talk about in planning and pre-construction, and I'm glad you've touched so much on that. This was another president, it might have been Eisenhower, who said that plans are nothing, but planning is everything, right? Because aren't you always planning on a project? Let's say you finish the design, but then you're planning your work. You're making work plans. You're always in a perpetual state of planning and executing. Is that correct?
Yep. Look, we can hit on. I think we hit on that topic.
We can be talking for the next 8 hours over here.
Yeah. and at the end of the day, what you were going back to the initial question, what I've seen over the course of it, I'm very encouraged by the development of the industry by incorporating into itself the technological developments that are great fabric of the economy has fostered, and welcoming it into our industry that was basically a hammer and chisel, back in the 60s and 70s. We've come so far, okay? But again, what it comes down to is, I forget who said this also, but don't matter what protocol or process or administrative procedures you come up with, if the people don't buy into them, they don't never going to work. And we now have so many great tools. And what you mentioned is, as this country now goes into a phase of rebuilding itself, which I really hope it will, because we sorely need it. Just drive your car around over bridges and tunnels and roads, and look at the you hear every day about the failure of this, that, and the other thing going on. You know that the country has to do what it did 100 years ago and 100 years before that. It has to take care of its own neighborhood. Here in this country, we got to rebuild all of that, because we built great things, and we built them without the tools we have today.
Right. So, and I think that's something in the fabric of American society. It's in our fabric that we are a country that prides itself on doing the difficult things, as President Kennedy said, that you have to do things that are hard, right? You have to do the difficult things. And construction is an industry that's so vital, not only for our city, because New York City is about construction, real estate and construction, but it's really important for the whole country. And that's why having this positive message, encouraging people to think differently and to work in collaboration with each other to find economic value, I think that's why we're here. We're here to add value every single day as professionals. And I think what could be more important than that, for us? So it's really great. I feel like we're gonna continue this conversation, but I really appreciate the insight expertise, and more importantly, the guidance and friendship that you have offered to so many, including myself. And it's really been an honor to have you on this forum. And you know, we'll continue this. This is really great, and you've given us a lot to think about, John.
I'd love to, Ravi. Our friendship runs longer and deeper than this short little podcast, which I am grateful to be a part of, and I thank you. And you know, here's one of the great things that you mentioned me as your mentor. You have also been mine,
Oh, that's
because
very thoughtful.
we have learned from each other by being. We never really had that kind of relationship where somebody was the boss. We were, I don't know if collaborators is the right word, but we understood very clearly together that the only way that any of us were going to succeed is to understand each other's talents, recognize our own shortfalls. You know, you mentioned earlier before the podcast that people have to recognize what they also can't do, and to either A, learn how to do them, or B, find those people that do them. And that's how we met, is that I knew what I couldn't do, and I had to find somebody that could do it. And from there, we learned together
it's great
that there is nothing that can't be done. There is, and this is what you get to your students and whoever else. There is nothing in this world that can't be done. And as Confucius once said, hey, remember that guy that fell down and never got up? And you know what the answer was? Neither did anybody else.
That's
with
right.
that,
That's the ultimate failure. Thank you,
bid
John.
I thank you. Have a great one. And look forward to seeing you again or another podcast whenever you would like. Thank you so much.
Sure. Take care.